Good morning. My name is Brenda, Nyandiko Sanya, and I'll be talking to you about a paper that's a work in progress, and any kinds of feedback is definitely appreciated. So the title of my talk is Porous Categories, Citizenship Documentation and the Performativity of Citizenship. Transnational migration makes visible the porous nature of identities in relation to social, cultural, and legal categories. Centered on citizenship and immigration documentation as producers and mediators of rights and responsibilities, this paper considers the limitations of legal citizenship, specifically in relation to colonial and racial histories. I identify how globalization and transnational migration impact and are impacted by identity markers such as race, class, gender, and sexuality, including how legal categories are supported or challenged by cultural citizenship. I rely on diaspora, as articulated by Hall, and the performativity of citizenship, as articulated by Isaac West, to interrogate how racialized post-colonial legacies of immigrants interact with their racialized identities living in the United States. And so I situate citizenship as both a legal and a performed category to further understand and have a nuanced understanding of transnational flows of culture, rights, and responsibilities. The contentious relationship between citizenship and rights is not unique to a particular nation or state. However, what is distinct in different nations is how the national documentation, regulation, and the performance of citizenship mediates these rights. So citizenship, globalization, migration, immigration, diasporas, mobility, patriotism, nationalism, jingoism, then become categories that have capacious bounds. However, citizenship often takes center stage in these conversations, and it's a location where laws and social contracts meet and ostensibly secure rights of individuals in relation to the state. And when I say ostensibly secure these rights, we think about how certain people with citizenship documentation don't receive full rights within the state in different capacities and on different scales. So therefore, citizenship is not only restricted or policed during border crossings or within the borders, but also through the categories and their underlying assumptions about the articulations of the law. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is kind of an interesting place to start because it is where the victories of the 13th and the 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution are extended to include Black people born in the United States to citizenship. With the overturning of Dred Scott v. Sanford in the legislation in 1857 and the broadening of the legal definition of citizenship, U.S. Americans who are descendants of African slaves were the first time acknowledged as citizenship. And so the inclusion of the term naturalization and at the same time of born citizenship in the clauses of Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution then signals to immigration and migration at the same time, and as well as people who are born within the country. And this is important because the clause captures the idea of privileges and immunities as well as emphasizing on the idea of due process. And so in that clause, the 3 points that I kind of single out are the idea of naturalization, privileges and immunities, as well as due process. And all these secure rights in kind of an ambiguous social way that are undergirded by legality, but at the same time, they're silent on cultural enforcements. So what I'm getting at is the idea that, due process, the idea of due process, what does due process really mean in terms of a cultural moment? Encounters with police or encounters with vigilantes, what does that look like? So I talk about this in terms of how Roberto Esposito thinks about it in Bios, and Bios is a follow-up to Foucault's biopolitics. And in Bios, Esposito explicates the ways in which biopower is can be looked at as almost like a pathogen that's fighting forms of life and endangering majority in relationship to citizenship and migration. Esposito's politics over life can then be read as an immune system. The borders, laws, state surveillance, and compliance with citizenship laws are defending the body, which is the American citizenship, through state power, and thereby eventually turn against the system itself. So the nation itself can then turn against immigrants in this biopolitical articulation. So then migration policy can be thought about as a form of immunization against the threat of a pathogenic group. So if we're talking about immigration, you're thinking about national identity and cultural identity of citizenship being always at threat of this external cultural dilution or disease in whatever way you think about it. And so I take that kind of understanding of citizenship and the citizen as kind of this body that needs to be protected from the outsider, and bring in two African populations that are migrant communities. And the first is Afropolitans, as they're termed, and the second is Sapors. And in her often cited article, Bye Bye Babar, Selassie comes up with the term Afropolitanism, which provides insights on race, modernity, and identity within a particular African diasporic subculture. And if you take a close look at Afropolitanism, you notice that it is imbricated in commodification, late capitalism, and the consumption that accompanies late capitalism. In rejecting citizenship, Selassie attempts to articulate and entitle Afropolitans with a hyper-citizenship, a fluid movement not bound by laws or cultural expectations, where rights and responsibilities are ostensibly relinquished for mobility and cultural admixtures of middle-class educated African nomads. Selassie asserts that Afropolitanism is a move away from pejorative monolithic African identities. However, it's important to note that a closer read shows that the term is not a simple, innocuous cultural identity. It relies on markers of middle-class aspirations, of lifestyles. So in it, she defines the Afropolitan as the person that you'll find at a law firm, a chem lab, or at a jazz lounge. And on this fictive relationship between economic success and modernity, and is located in the economic, more corporate model, and also relies on bootstrapping, because she asserts this move towards, Africans who are Afropolitan have a famed work ethic, and are, located also in academic exceptionalism. So they collect a variety of PhDs across the ball. And so in advancing Afropolitanism, and kind of trying to shift it away from this very middle-class assertion, Achille Mbembe locates Selassie's work in a longer history of African migration to, from, and within the continent. Mbembe awakens the African that we see and moves us towards thinking about global Africans, which includes Africans on the continent. For Mbembe, African culture on and off the continent involves cultural mixing and interweaving of worlds. And so to kind of nuance Bye Bye Babar and Afropolitanism and move it away from African exceptionalism, aspirations that are focused on Western ideals, Mbembe kind of locates Afropolitanism more in Anthony Kwame Apia's idea of what is African identity if it does not reach into Africa to think about identity. The second population, and actually I should have shown you that. So the second population that I talk about are the Sapors, who are, ironically, the Sapors are the society of elegant persons from the Congo, but they're not considered as, chic or as interesting to people, and they personify a different kind of African immigrants. They tend to be undocumented or school dropouts, and they are, if the Afropolitans are, their hallmark is mobility, the Sapors are immobile in that sense because they're limited by their documentation. In Congo Paris, a book by Magafi and Bazingusa Ganga, the authors describe Sapors as living on the margins by choice, rejecting the activities and values of mainstream societies at home and abroad. And that's not to say that they don't participate in society, but they choose to live a life that kind of shuns Western ideals as they are in existence and try to create a new identity. And Magafi and Bazunga Ganga also describe their lives as counter-hegemonic in the sense that they participate in global processes as much as they can, but they also create identities that are in resistance to these global processes. And unlike the Afropolitan, whose migrant identities are given, for Sapores, who are also considered the African dandy, migration is an aspiration linked to fashion capitalism, capitals and colonial metropoles of Europe. Thomas, who has extensively written about them, argues that for the Sapores, life's implications are linked to cultural dislocation and involves acknowledgement of one's clothes, costumes, mannerisms, and other consumables by the public and creating a public. And publics and counterpublics here are important and significant. And I locate the group of Sapores in what Michael Warner has called counterpublics. Counterpublic lives that are at odds with the dominant discourse and the norms that constitute dominant culture as a public. Warner explains, and I quote here, "Counterpublic discourse is far more than the expression of subaltern culture and far more than what Foucauldians like to call reverse discourse," end quote. The migrant who returns or is seen in communities linked to the homeland will put an inordinate effort into what is considered a symbolic capital in their clothing. And here are some images of Sapores. And you notice in these images the stark contrast, like, is in a garbage heap but is pristinely dressed in a white suit. So this kind of assertion of a counterpublic. And I read these counterpublics as a resistance to the quotidian experiences of being reduced to a state of what Agamben has called the bare life, which is basically less than citizens. Thus, the collective and alienating space of the collection of the Sapores, which is called the SAPE, draws attention and demands recognition, as Hubbard has noted. If the public does not, if the group does not exist in public, it is effectively invisible in the eyes of the state and distant citizens, apparently having no rights or needs. And these patterns of rejection and assimilation between host and immigrant communities can be located also in Dick Hebbage's discussion of conjecture and subjectivity. And so in Sapores, we see physical markers of African hybridity mimicking hybrid cultural identity, whose mimicry seemingly takes on the identity and puts imperial subjects in jeopardy. And conversely, the Afropolitans can be understood in being complicit in Baba's echoing of Lacanian terms of mimicry. Baba explains mimicry as repetition as opposed to representation. So with the Sapores, you can see kind of a recreation of a culture, versus with the Afropolitans, it's kind of a mimicry in the Baba terms. And Baba suggests that in the ambiguity constituted through empire's own methods, a dangerous hybridity emerges and puts the imperial subject in jeopardy. Sapores refuse to be invisible. The visibility nullifies isomorphic depictions, excuse me. I don't know why that was so hard to say. Depictions of African migrant identities or the ambitions and aspirations of African immigrants. And so their flamboyance and their resistance to not be seen becomes then a different counterculture of what we would like to think about in thinking about Africans in a model of kind of this Africa rising. The Sapores is not the good African who is rising. And they are a reminder that Africans arriving or rising is not something that is a destination that can be located only in Western terms. And when you have sanctimonious titles like "The Nigerians Have Arrived," which actually was a very interesting paper that I saw at the African Students Forum. Someone showed us this article, and I was writing this paper, and I read the article, and it was actually a little troubling. I mean, where have they arrived from? And it's in the Talta, which is a British middle-class, upper middle-class magazine, actually, and it circulates rhetorics of emergent Africa whose success is linked to global capitalism, disregarding the debilitating and unequalizing effects of global capitalism. Furthermore, the contents declare, and these are direct quotes, "You don't have to go to Mars or Lagos," because Mars and Lagos are the same, of course, "to see the fruits of that action," and that's end quote. And then another quote is, Nigerians all say that they work hard, party hard, and believe that they are better than anyone else," end quote. And then another one is, "Nigerians collect PhDs like confetti and are intensely entrepreneurial." Or another one, "It is the African century, and here in London, the Nigerians are the standard bearers, jostling the Arabs, the Russians out of the picture," end quote. So, I mean, just jumping around in terms of these very strange articulations. And for me, I see it as being very othering and fetishizing. And it's a punctuated absurdity about belonging while not belonging. It is palpable in the othering of other racially marginalized groups as a way of celebrating. Thank you. And it's almost, again, thinking about the location of where it's published in a British upper middle class, so it's almost as if it's a titillating experience for the British, like the Nigerians have arrived. Then what do we do with this, right? Because it's a threat, but it's not a threat, and we locate them in a way that considers them like they're Martians, again. And so, I'll just jump through a bit because I have a short time. But what I think about is I take on Agamben's notion of sovereignty to illuminate the distinction between citizen and immigrant. In Homo sacer, sovereignty functions as the mechanisms, the apparatus through which nationalism and the separation of the citizen from the immigrant can be achieved. Agamben argues, and this is a direct quote, "In the system of this nation state, the so-called sacred and inalienable rights of man show themselves to lack every protection and reality at the moment in which they can no longer take the form of rights belonging to citizens of the state," end quote. So linked to citizenship is sovereignty, which is inherent to be the citizen. The immigrant then lacks the sovereignty of the citizen. Thus, even though they might have some access to some rights, these immunities are not guaranteed. And jumping forward and thinking about performativity and performance of citizenship, I think about it in terms articulated both by Butler and Isaac West, following Judith Butler. And West argues that citizenship, like gender, is performative. In other words, it's both illusory and non-essential. It's fabricated and sustained only through stylized, repetitive corporal acts. Performativity, developed as relates to gender, and can be applied to other identities such as race, ability, ethnicity, nationality. Performance, the process of repetitive corporal actions, constitutes and is constituted essentially through these corporal acts. Therefore, to be American, which is linked to legal documentation, is not only linked to ontological claims about birth, ancestry, or documentation. To be a citizen requires one to act like a citizen. So in West's words, the performativity of citizenship entails a reiteration of discourses already operating in culture, discourses saturated with history and ripe for the potential for appropriation. As spaces of citizenship are performatively reproduced, individuals do and undo citizenship. They do citizenship as they rely upon the discursive expectations to gain recognition as subjects. So performance and performativity then reinscribes what we think about and how we consider citizenship. And so to link citizenship to cultural markers is not to deny the importance of documentation, but to assert that the ambiguity of doing or performing citizenship and the irregularities that render one included or excluded. And so acts of compliance, for example, are acts of performance and performativity. So you go to renew your passport or you go to renew your driver's license, you're asserting that documentation is valid and then therefore you are performing, but at the same time it's a performative act in the sense that you are saying that this is to be a citizen, to have documentation. And so in conclusion, and this is, kind of groundwork to think about my broader research project for my dissertation, which will be looking at Kenyan immigrants living in the United States. I'm thinking about the fractures of citizenships and how they can be seen in relation to Black people in the United States and to the state. So while legal documents may not be in question for American-born Black, U.S. American-born Black people, citizenship rights are always in question. In understanding the performativity of citizenship, post-colonial African identities, this essay is examining citizenship and immigration as porous categories, and these porous categories are also negotiated categories which reinforce, mediate, and are mediated by documentation in an attempt to, what Ferguson has called, make visible the discontinuities of African American racial formations. Locating these Kenyans in the narrative where success of a section of minorities is often used to invalidate the structural injustices of a majority, such as seen in dialogues and discourses about post-racism and such that we're all familiar with. This paper is an interrogation of cultural imperatives to secure what cultural imperatives secure citizen rights, while at the same time denying immigrants' rights based on race, based on the phenotypic realities linked to US racial history, xenophobia, and jingoism of citizenship or not citizenship. In addition to their connections to homelands, immigrants are expected to acculturate into a culture of a host country. They're expected to understand and perform a new ethnicity and identity. For every success or mobility of Afropolitans within the capitalist systems, there are numerous failures among African immigrants and Black people, and inevitably Afropolitanism then has its limits when it comes to experiencing life in the United States. While diasporas trouble meanings of race and are also at the same time trouble ideas of exceptionalism, looking at Afropolitans and Sapor's lives, we think about race and class, and we must think about class as a way to understand what does the US idealize as a correct citizen or a correct immigrant. So Etienne Lubied, who is a legal scholar at University of Arizona, has talked essentially about how normative lives that are middle class then become the location for what is a good citizen. And so in closing, I say that, thinking about an example of the killing of the Guinean immigrant Amadou Diallo, it fits directly into the US narrative of racialized bodies, which then calls into question the idea of exceptionalism and performance and Afropolitanism or Africa Rising. And so Amadou Diallo's life and death at the hands of the police remains in the trajectory of slavery, Jim Crow, police brutality against Rodney King, the killing of Sean Bell and Patrick Jersmond. Diallo's public trial by the police officer can be ascribed to the racial history as opposed to a border crossing. In this way, while documentation and performance of citizenship are potent, there are limitations in explaining rights. Thank you.